Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Last week we spoke. The last couple of weeks we've been speaking about the journey of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, and we've touched on the lives of other prophets kind of along that way. And the reason why we're doing that is because this is a class on the Sira, but actually I believe anyway that to really appreciate it, we need to go as far back as possible, because this is a linear kind of connected chain, and the chain goes back to our father, who's Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, and then prior to him it would have been to Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, and prior to him it would be Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam. So we've got these three fathers of our nation, starting at the time of Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam as the father of, Abul Bashar, the father of mankind, up to the point of the Great Flood, where mankind, according to many of the scholars, the few that were on that ship were the only people that survived, and civilization kind of started from there, which makes Sayyidina Nuh also our father. And then from there, what we have is the birth of Islam comes through the channel of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, which makes Sayyidina Ibrahim our father, which is why on the Mi'raj, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam referred to them as his father. So everyone else, when they greeted the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they said, marhaban, ya akh salih, ya nabiy salih, al akh salih, welcome, O righteous prophet, O righteous brother. And when he went to Sayyidina Ibrahim in the seventh heaven, and when he met Sayyidina Adam, they both said the same. Sayyidina Adam in the first heaven, they both said marhaban, welcome. And they said, ya nabiy salih, O righteous prophet, al ibn salih, O righteous son. Yeah, so we come through their change. So I think it's important to touch on those. And another reason why I think it's important is just to show how many gaps there are in terms of history. A lot of kind of the knowledge gaps are filled with anecdote or with stories from different traditions, be it the Bible or elsewhere, or just through storytellers. And I'm not, although I don't want to dismiss those, because sometimes they do make for good fillers, it's just worth, all of you understanding and seeing how much of it is actually covered in the Quran. There is a fair amount, but there's a lot that is that goes unsaid. I think that's important too, because the Quran, this is a question that's come up in the past. I can't remember who. I think it was Sheikh Nuh that answered it actually, which I like his answer. This is going back 15 years or so. I think somebody asked the question, like, why doesn't God mention dinosaurs in the Quran? And the Sheikh said, well, for the same reason that he doesn't mention simple things like your ironing and your shopping trips. I don't think he used those examples, but the point was that God doesn't mention every minutiae. He mentions what is significant and what's critical for us to be able to to absorb the message and to convey the message. And obviously then you also have what some of the Sahaba would say about about the Quran. They say, Allahu Alam, that Sayyidina Ali would say that if I wanted to find my lost camel, I would be able to find it in Surah Al-Fatiha. In other words, you can find whatever you want in the Quran if you seek hard enough. In other words, if you know what you're looking for. I think that's more a reference, Allahu Alam, that's more a reference to the depth of the Quran. And there's so many answers in it, and they're not always at that surface layer, that you need to do a bit more reading of it. And the familiarity of the whole corpus of the Quran is actually quite important. Assuming that you can pick up a verse in the middle of the Quran and think that you can translate it and understand it, is you may understand the verse, but actually the story is missing, which is what I've tried to do with the story of Sayyidina Nuh and also with the story of Sayyidina Ibrahim. to just demonstrate that actually, if you want to know the story of Ibrahim, you're not going to find the whole story in Surah Ibrahim. You actually have to go to other surahs. You have to go to Surah Hud. Why would you know to check Surah Hud? You have to go to Surah Safat. You have to go to other places, and what you do is you and Surah Baqarah even, and through it, what you do is you kind of build up the narrative, and then you start to get a fuller picture. So simply translating it is not enough, and therefore simply knowing Arabic is not enough. What it requires is an attitude and desire to want to understand the Quran. So actually, there are many people that know Arabic but have no desire to appreciate the linguistic miracle of the Quran. Actually, get into it and read it, which is fascinating, because people spend 10 years studying Arabic and never once pick up the Quran to act with the intention of reading it to understand it, which might seem like a shock to many of you, but I think that's true for many of us. And I don't really know why, but I think that is pretty much the norm, unfortunately. Yet there's many people out there that don't know Arabic and have a real heartfelt longing to learn Arabic for the sake of connecting to the Quran. Most people that I teach Arabic to, I mean, my students, those who are online now, will vouch for this. Hopefully, that in the very first few lessons, I do ask this question: why are you studying Arabic? And I ask it not because necessarily I glean something from it for me personally, or whether it changes necessarily how I go about teaching, although it may influence it in some way. But it's more about you being clear about why you're studying it. And hopefully in that moment, in that panic moment where you suddenly have to think about it, I hope that as when people's motivation wanes, that they remember that moment because they had that emotional connection to it. But it's interesting because more often than not, and I don't know if it's just a default answer people give because they think that's what I want to hear, is they say it's because they want to connect to the Quran. So I think it's fascinating that people who don't know it, who know Arabic, don't probably use it as, and I'm generalizing, but I think a lot of people don't necessarily go to the Quran. We go everywhere but the Quran. They say about Imam al-Razi, the great theologian. He wrote at least 2 works of tafsir, and his most famous one it's known as Tafsir al-Kabir, and it's called Mafatih al-Ghaib, the keys to the unseen. And the kind of, there's a saying amongst the scholars that it contains everything but tafsir of the Quran. It's just so much depth of knowledge that every word takes him into a different science, and a lot of it's theological. But by the time you've got through even a volume of his 11-volume tafsir, you've got everything but understanding the basic Quran. So there's so much depth to our religion, but there's a danger. My teacher always says, Allama Rasul Bak Sa'idi, he said it to us many times, and more recently, over the last 5 years or so, he's really been adamant about this, that he always says, go back to the Quran, go back to Hadith, go back to the usul, and that's where the pleasure is. Otherwise, everything else can become a bit of a distraction, and I think you certainly find that. So it is important to try and, as wherever to the degree that it's possible, to try and take this back to the Quran, and eventually you'll see we'll start shifting away from the Quran. When I say shifting, what I mean is most of the kind of the stories of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam will be centered around Hadith, because not because the Quran doesn't tell us much about the Prophet's life, because it tells us a huge amount. But actually, there's so much in his life that's captured in Hadith. And the reason for that is because the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, although he initially prohibited the companions from writing down the Hadith, and the reasons that the scholars give for that is because when Quran was being initially revealed to the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, there was a danger that people would confuse what was Quran and what was the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's own words. And for that reason, he prohibited it. But later on, he allowed it. And many of the Sahaba, then we had the scribes of the Prophet who would not only write Quran, but would write Hadith too. And we know that some of the Sahaba, they had mushafs. So mushaf is what we call the physical Quran itself, as we refer to it as a mushaf. Each companion, or many of the companions, had their own written mushafs. And they would in the marginalia write their notes, and those notes would be hadith, what the Prophet said. And not to go into that story right now, but this was one of the I suppose quote unquote problems that Sayyidina Abu Bakr faced and Sayyidina Uthman later faced, which was how do we verify what is the kind of inimitable Quran that there's no doubt about, that everyone agrees is Quran and is not the marginalia or not the notes of the Prophet, I mean the hadith of the Prophet. So they had to go through a whole process to make sure that doesn't happen. So what the Prophet foresaw certainly did happen, but the timing was perfect, because initially the Sahaba did not write hadith down as they were getting used to the style of the Quran. And then as they became comfortable with it, they knew when it was wahy and when it wasn't, then they were allowed to write it down, because at this point they would recognize this is what the Prophet's interpretation or his tafsir of it was, and what is actually supposed to be written Quran. So there is so much by way of hadith that we have. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of hadith. It would be, what I'd want to do is I'd want to use as much of the hadith as possible, inshallah. Okay, so where do we get to last week? So last week we spoke about Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. They've left their homeland. They've been the Sayyidina Ibrahim has been commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So through revelation, is told to leave his hometown and go to a place called Canaan. Right? Canaan is in Sham, in kind of modern day, that Syria, Palestine region, which is known as Sham. And he leaves, and he's so on the way there. It's him, his wife, and then there's various accounts as to who else is with him. Some say Sayyidina Lut was with him, the Prophet Lut, who was his cousin. Was with him, and some say others were with him too, his brother, some say, and his brother's wife, and so on. So there's various accounts, not very relevant, to be fair, some of it for our purposes, and none of it is mentioned explicitly in either the Quran or, as far as I'm aware, in any authentic hadith. Allahu alam. So on the way, so they stop in a place called Hebron, and they're there for some time. And in Hebron is where we know that the Sayyidina Ibrahim's father passed away, Tariq. And there's a difference of opinion, as I said, as to whether Tariq was in fact Azar, or whether Azar was his uncle that was referred to, that the Prophet Ibrahim referred to as father, because we know Azar, mentioned in the Quran, was a polytheist. He didn't believe in God. But there's a difference of opinion as to whether Azar was in fact Tariq. And many of the historians say they were the same person, whereas others have said, by way of deduction, that the Prophet ﷺ said that he was passed from pure loins to pure loins, and they interpret that as therefore Sayyidina Ibrahim being in that lineage, he would have also been born of pure loins. And what that means is pure in terms of believing in one God. So they say Azar therefore could not be the father of Ibrahim, so he must be interpreting the Quran and its use of the word Azar as his father. They interpret it as being his uncle. And others say no. It probably, again, is not massively significant for our purposes, just so that at least you're aware of the kind of historical difference. And there's other scholarly opinions on this. This is kind of for them to really delve into. For us, we're interested in the story. So we know that Tariq passed away, and it's said, and again, there's no mention of this in the Quran and or any of the well-known hadith literature, that Tariq was about 205 years old. That's what Imam Tabari says. That's what Ibn Khaldun says. He was 205 years old when he died. He was buried in Hebron. Sayyidina Ibrahim, so from when they left, so the initial commandment from God was for them to go to Hebron, and from Hebron they were commanded to go to a place called Canaan. As I said, it's in Syria, Palestine. And at that point, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also promised Sayyidina Ibrahim that from his offspring, there will be a nation that would be born that would be found everywhere. If you look at the biblical traditions, they talk about it as much as when you look up at the sky and you see the stars, God says that, and so shall be your offspring. Yeah. But if you look at some of the Muslim historians, they describe it as God says there will be as many of your offspring as there are pebbles on the earth. Yeah. So it's interesting to see those two differences, that they kind of make reference to the stars in the sky, and we find ours is more earthy. It's about the pebbles and again, these are kind of historical points that we don't have any explicit literature on in terms of in the Quran or in the Hadith. These are through historical kind of narrations. So he's now at this point, Sayyidina Ibrahim doesn't have any children, and he's quite old. So and we have examples where Sayyidina Ibrahim asks God, and I will go into some of these, where he asks God for pure offspring. And we know that when he was when he left his homeland, so the Ur of Chaldea, when he left from there in Iraq, he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he would be blessed with a righteous offspring. So he did. So we know that the dua was made by Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now en route to, so this is now before, so on the way to Canaan now, we know that Ibrahim alayhi salam headed towards Egypt. Ibrahim and Sarah both went to Egypt. And the reason why they went to Egypt was because they'd heard of a famine that had hit Canaan. So what they went for is help. But they also knew that the person that was the king there, the prince of Egypt, wasn't a righteous man. So Sayyidina Ibrahim tells Sarah, according to some of these accounts, he tells Sarah to say that she is his sister, not his wife. And the reason for this is that because that effectively seems to be a lie, and there's a hadith where it's referred to as the 3 lies, of Ibrahim alayhi salam. But this is lie kind of inverted commas, because the reason why he said that is that king was known to, if he was attracted to a woman and she was married, he would just have the husband executed. Yeah, he'd have the husband executed. So he was worried that they would have Sayyidina Ibrahim executed. So he told her to say that she was his sister. And again, as a prophet, he was being inspired by God. And we know that Sayyidina Sarah was then given this miraculous gift of her dua, that when she was alone with this king, and Sayyidina Ibrahim didn't go in because he knew that this is the domain of God. When the king tried to touch her, she would immediately, he would freeze. And we know it happened, according to these accounts, it happened 2 or 3 times. And eventually the king, realizing that there was something was, at this point, he was scared. He was angry and he was scared. And he refers to her as an evil sorceress. And according to some accounts, that because he was afraid, he gave her Hajar. And Hajar, by the way, is the mother of Sayyidina Ismail. She's also referred to in some, books of history, Muslim history books like Tabari and others. They refer to her as Ajar. So Ajara or Hajara, both of these are readings of her name, and that's because of the way they would pronounce the ha. Some would pronounce it with the ah. Now, assuming that's where Hajara was, or Hajar was given to Sarah, because there is difference of opinion on this. Some say that it happened a bit later on by the king of Jordan. So let's go with that narrative, that she was given to say that Sarah to attend to her needs, so a handmaid. Um, so when they left, when they left, and they headed to Canaan, yeah, they went to Canaan, and they stayed there. Uh, as far as we know, it was about 10 years before Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam was gifted. So Sayyida Sarah gave Ibrahim alayhi salam Hajra, yeah, or Hajar. She gave Hajar to him because, again, that there was these dreams that Sayyidina Ibrahim was having, that God will give him a nation that will come through him, a great nation that will come through him. And at this point, Sarah was getting quite old, and again, this is in the Quran now. She's getting quite old, and she thought, if it can't be through me, and we know she was a righteous woman. So Sayyidah Sarah was a righteous woman, as opposed to what you find in the biblical accounts. Because in the biblical account, Sarah is described as a jealous woman. Yeah, she's jealous. She does not like Hajar. And when Ibrahim, according to their account, when Ibrahim takes Hajar as his maid, she, according to the biblical account, she's jealous of that, and she starts misbehaving towards Hajar. Eventually, she forces Ibrahim alayhi salam to banish her. Yeah, that's not the Muslim account. Yeah, that's not the Muslim account. That's not to say the Muslim historians didn't transmit this, because they did. Yeah, the Muslim historians did transmit this. You do find this in the likes of Tabari, the likes of Ibn Khaldun, likes of, many other people have transmitted this. So it's not like it doesn't exist. So I'm not going to be pretend that we haven't said it. It's there. But we also know that she's described as a very religious, very upright woman. And I think the husn al-dhan, in the absence of knowing which of those accounts is stronger, I think the husn al-dhan definitely applies here, as a wife of a prophet. So the account that we follow is that Sayyidah Sarah gave Ibrahim alayhi salam, his Hajar, and she said, لَعَلَّ اللَّهَ يَرْزُقُكَ يَرْزُقُكَ مِنْهَا وَلَدٍ, that perhaps God will gift you a child through her instead of through me. Yeah. But of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had a greater plan. And that plan was that, yes, she would have offspring. He would have offspring through Hajar, but we know that he would also have offspring through Sarah, and they would become two great nations, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to in the Quran. So that happened about 10 years after they left Egypt. So there was some gap before at this point. So at the time of Hajar, giving birth to Sayyidina Ismail, Ibrahim was about 86 years old, right? So he was in his late 80s. And it's at that point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him the glad tidings. And not only is he having a son, but there will be offspring. His offspring will be in these 12 tribes and these the Banu Israel and so on. Kind of story begins at this point. The story of Sayyidina Lut alayhi salam is, I'm not going to go into it just because I'm conscious of time, but I would have liked to just spend a bit of time on that, but maybe on another occasion. But Sayyidina Lut, and it does cross over because Sayyidina Lut does, obviously they're related. Sayyidina Ibrahim and Sayyidina Lut are related. And we know that eventually they meet up again, and Sayyidina Ibrahim does meet Sayyidina Lut again. So at this point, when they leave Egypt and they're heading back, so this is before, so I'm kind of jumping back and forth 10 years now, but after they leave Egypt and Sayyida Sarah is given Hajar and they're moving back to Canaan, Sayyidina Lut parts ways and he goes because he has his calling from God as a prophet, and he's sent to his people in Palestine. So he heads into his direction, and then Sayyidina Ibrahim and Sayyidina Sarah go towards Canaan, and that's where 10 years later Hajar gives birth to Ismail alayhi salam. What do we know about so when Sayyidina Ismail is born, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands Sayyidina Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands so the question here, how old was Hajar at the time she gave birth? Don't know. There is no reliable account of how old Hajar was, except that she was a lot younger then. a lot younger than Sarah, but I don't know. I don't know the answer, and I've kind of looked into it, but not enough to be able to confidently say anything. To be honest, so if someone does know, do share it, and be interested to see where that comes from. But Allahu Alam. When she gave birth to, when Hajar gave birth to Ismail alayhi salam, it was at that point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he was still suckling, so he was really young, yeah, so he would have been under 1 year old at this point. It's at that point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands Sayyidina Ibrahim to take Hajar and his son and take them to a valley. Now, Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam is being guided by God. In some accounts, it says Sayyidina Jibreel took him and guided him. In other accounts, Sayyidina Ibrahim knew, he just felt he knew where he needed to go. Yeah. Either way, we know they ended up not far from the Haram, so in Mecca. Yeah, so near to Mecca, so where the kind of the source of Zamzam eventually was to be. So Ibrahim alayhi salam takes both Hajar and his infant child, his first child, the child that he's been longing for many years. So probably if we go by the dua was made in the Quran, when you follow the story in the Quran, from Surah Safat, what happens? The story is the king has Sayyidina Ibrahim put into the fire. Sayyidina Ibrahim then comes out of this fire miraculously, absolutely fine. The Quran tells us, Salamun ala Ibrahim, and may peace be upon Ibrahim. In other words, may he be safe. Kuni bardan wa salama. Yeah, be cool and be peaceful upon Ibrahim alayhi salam. After that, the Quran immediately goes in to telling us Sayyidina Ibrahim's dua to God, where he says, "Oh Allah, give me children amongst the Salihin." What that tells us is that his dua would have happened many years earlier, which means even if we go with a fairly conservative estimate, he would have been making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for probably 40 plus years, if not more. And when God eventually gives him a child, and this is the power of yaqeen, of certainty of a prophet, which it's not a daraja that you can have. You don't attain a certitude like a prophet. It's just given by God. So at this point, Sayyidina Ibrahim is given the news from God through revelation that he is to take his newborn son, his infant son, and his maid Hajar to away from their homeland, from Canaan, and to leave her there. And Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam doesn't question God. He doesn't question it. He says, if this is from God, we accept and obey. And he takes Sayyidina Ismail and Hajar, and they set off. And some accounts say that Hajar would ask him periodically, "Where are we going?" And he wouldn't respond. He wouldn't say anything. Because and there's kind of various reasons why. Assuming that were to be true, then some say the reason is because as a prophet, he stood steadfast to God's commandment, which is, God's told me to do this. I don't know why yet, so I won't speak until God tells me to. So he doesn't say anything. And the only words he does tell, this is according to one account, is when he eventually gets to the place that he believes is the place he's supposed to leave her. And some accounts says that Jibreel told him where to leave her. At that point, as he turns and he walks away, one account that Imam Ibn Khaldun mentions is that's when Sayyidah Hajar shouts out, she says, "Did God tell you to do this?" And Ibrahim at that point turns and says yes. And she says, if that's what God said, then that's how it will be. So that was the certitude of Sayyidah Hajar. She didn't question, that if it comes from God, we accept it as it is. Now, it's important to just to make a few, I guess, clarifications of people might have doubts in their mind. So firstly, this is a prophet. Yeah. So we don't make these grand explanations ourselves. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't wake up one morning and have this sudden moment of clarity and think I'm going to do something, um, which seems absurd to everybody else, and yet I'm certain that it's the right thing to do. I'm not allowed to do that. I can't do that. It's not even permissible for me to do it. And the reason why it's not permissible is when it comes to prophets and revelation can never be wrong. Yeah. So once somebody's prophecy is established, and it's established through various means, once it's established, their revelation can never be wrong. They can never be confused by their revelation. That's not true of a non-prophet. Of a non-prophet, it's not true. So therefore, you can have a very saintly individual, man or woman, that sees a dream and are absolutely certain of what that dream meant and still be wrong. Which is why, unless it's something that generally is a good thing to do and something that wouldn't mean you have to give up everything that you own, you wouldn't follow them. So if a sheikh suddenly had a dream that God says the Mahdi is coming next year, sell up and move out, guess what? Don't sell up and don't move out, because there have been many sheikhs that have had such dreams for centuries. And what you end up with is the only certainty you have is you'll be left homeless, and lots of certitude, but no home to go to. So you've got to be very careful where people make these sorts of claims. I'm not saying the dishonest people; they may be very dishonest. They may be very honest. I beg your pardon. They may be very honest in the dream that they saw, and they probably did. There'd be some truth in it, but their interpretation is just this: the nature of revelation. That when it comes to when somebody is inspired by God, their interpretation can be wrong. But when God reveals to somebody, i.e., a prophet, then it can never be wrong, because prophecy entails a calling of some sort. So if there was any doubt in their interpretation of it, it create doubt in the very calling itself. So therefore, it's impossible that be the case. But when it comes to somebody's personal yaqeen, it should be left personal. So if I have a dream tomorrow of the Mahdi coming, I should not make a pronouncement such that it causes a lot of people a lot of hardship. I should try and find a way of helping people without causing them undue hardship, and accept that actually I could be wrong, because a person is, none of us are have that gift of prophecy. So if ever you hear of these sorts of things, just always be mindful of that we're not questioning somebody's veracity. It's possible that someone could be lying to. There's many charlatans out there who are more than happy to take advantage of very gullible or agreeable people. But let's assume that most people are honest and sincere about it. But you can't cite Ibrahim alayhi salam, and nor can we cite the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when it comes to matters of prophecy. Okay, so anything when it comes to matters of prophethood, there's no point quoting that the Prophet did the same thing or Ibrahim did the same thing, because they were prophets. So when that moment happened where Sayyidah Hajar now is she's in this place just outside of Mecca, and Sayyidina Ibrahim turns and he walks away. There's a huge gap here, because there's not much that we know. We know about the incident itself, but in terms of the surrounding story of what happens with Sayyidina Ibrahim, where does he go, all of that is pretty much missing for the most part. And a lot of even people who describe this story often miss that bit out. And as you would have hopefully noticed, that sometimes we're talking years and years between events. Even in a surah, you can have a verse and then there's 20 years have passed, and then there's the next verse. And although it may have been revealed at the same time to the Prophet ﷺ, the actual events themselves were quite sparse in terms of how they unfolded. So here so the historians kind of try and fill the gaps here. But again, there's nothing authentic that we know about, or that I know about, I should say. So what happens, according to this one account that I've read, is Sayyidina Ibrahim returns on at least three occasions, three occasions, to see Sayyidina Ismail, and it's on that third occasion that he stays with him a lot longer. Yeah. But he does periodically come to see his son as he's growing up. At this point, Sayyidina Ibrahim turns away and he's now left, and Sayyidina Hajar is there on her own. It's here that then Sayyidina Ismail starts crying because he's thirsty as a infant, and he wants some milk. And Sayyida Hajar is herself thirsty, so she can't provide milk for him, nor can he drink any water because there's nothing there. And it's a dry, barren land. We know there was nothing around for miles, and it was very and it was a very hot day, as it often was in that part of the world, and it still is. So there's different accounts as to what happens. One account is that Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam comes to Hajar and consoles her. So seeing the distress of a mother, he comes and consoles her, and he tells her that there's a part here where there will be a spring that comes from it. And he takes his heel and he gets, when Ismail's there, Ismail digs his heel in from the direction of Jibril, and that's when the water comes through. But that happens after Sayyida Hajar has run 7 times up and down these 2 hills to see. And what she's doing is each time she runs up and she's looking to see if anyone's there, and she's praying to God. And then she goes to the other hill. So one's called Safa and the other one's called Marwa, as we know of them today. And she runs up the other hill and she prays to God, and she runs back up, which is why what we do now during the Hajj and the Umrah is we go up each of those hills, and each time we make dua. And what we do is we do exactly as Sayyida Hajar did. Is she didn't walk, she hurried. Yeah, she hurried, that's the instincts of a mother, that her child is hungry, so she does this this kind of move from one place to another. And that's why you see pilgrims, when we do it, we don't walk slowly. You're supposed to neither run nor walk, but somewhere in between, where you're kind of hurrying, kind of scuttling almost from one place to another. And it's a place of mustajab dua, which means a place where when you make dua, we hope that Allah will accept it, as he did the dua of Sayyidina Hajar. So regardless of whether it happened with or without Sayyidina Jibreel's intervention, either way, it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's intervention. And through it, as Sayyida Hajar was moving up through these 2 hills, Sayyidina Ismail, as a baby, as an infant does, lying on the floor, he's rubbing his feet into the ground, he's digging his heel in, and eventually he digs it in on that seventh movement run up the hill. The spring kind of gushes forth, and when that spring comes, that's the spring of Zamzam. That's the fountain of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls this is the place. This becomes a place of sanctuary for all people that were all visitors that would come afterwards. So that's where Mecca became a sanctuary for people, because prior to that, the Zamzam had been buried for a long time. So they found it again, and it disappears again. So I'm not going to touch on that today, but in a future lesson in the Sira, you'll see how this well of Zamzam itself is quite important, because after some time and some battles taking place, eventually that Zamzam is lost again, and it's refound again through the ancestry of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the Quraysh. So we will talk about that inshallah when we get to that point. So at that point now, when he is when the fountain is raised, Sayyida Hajar then feeds her, drinks, and feeds her hungry, thirsty child, Sayyidina Ismail, completely content that this is the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then there's quite a big gap. We don't know what happened, other than some of the scholars say that there was a passing tribe at this point, and that tribe were the people of Jurhum. So you may recall we talked about the 3 types of Arabs, and we said that Jurhum, or the Jurhumites as they're known as, were the pure Arabs that stem from Yemen. So they were at this point traveling, and they, as far as they were concerned, there was no water. This is a barren land. So when they saw water, this fountain gushing forth, and a mother there, somebody there with a child, they were surprised. So when they arrived and they asked if they can drink from that water, and then they decided that that's where they were going to set up camp, and that's what they did. And then the story moves pretty fast from that point, because what we hear is that they decide to stay. and Sayyidina Ismail grows up around them, around this tribe, and he learns their language, which is where the Arabic comes from. So this is the first time Arabic meets the family of Ibrahim alayhi salam, because Ismail learns very quickly. He plays with their children, he grows up around them, and he learns Arabic for the first time, and that's where we have the Arabic language through Sayyidina Ismail, which would be preserved in terms of the Adnani lineage, which goes to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what happens is then Ibrahim alayhi salam is back in Canaan with Sarah. There is a gap in terms of we don't know what's happening there, other than a few years later when the story goes back to the family of Sarah and Ibrahim alayhi salam, when Allah gives them the glad tidings of their next of Ishaq, Ismail's brother. But in this period, in these 13 years, nothing is mentioned of, or at least nothing that I'm aware of. So Sayyidina Ismail is growing up around them. Sayyidina Ibrahim is not mentioned to be there, but as I said, we believe there were 3 occasions at least that Sayyidina Ibrahim came. They say Ya'tadu, which means he regularly visited. So there's minimum 3 occasions when he came, but there's people like Ibn Khaldun say that actually Ibrahim, and I think he refers to Imam Tabari, that actually Ibrahim would regularly come and see Ismail and spend time with him, and then he would go back to his wife Sarah. But that was part of the covenant with his responsibility with God as a prophet, that he had to do that, and Ismail had to grow up in that way, in that land and with those people. So what happens after that? And so we know that there's a significant event which, according to the biblical accounts, happens at the age of 13. But within the Muslim tradition, there's a difference of opinion on it. Some say it was around the age of 13. Some say it was a lot sooner. It was around 7 or 8 years old. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is because the Quran mentions, the Quran mentions in Surah Safat, in Surah Safat. So kind of rewinding back to what I said before about God talks about this, protection from what happened in his homeland from the king, and then it goes into فَبَشَّرْنَاهُ بِغُلَامٍ حَلِيمٍ. Allah says, and then we gave Sayyidina Ibrahim glad tidings of a forbearant child. فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَعَهُ السَّعْيَ قَالَ, and when he, meaning Ismail, reached, so this is the first account we have of Sayyidina Ismail in the Quran. And when he reached, we have a number of mentions of his name, but actually the particular events unfolding in his early life come here. What God says, and when he reached a sa'ya, when he reached a time where he can bear hardship, yes. So this would be where they would usually set them to work. Yeah. So فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَعَهُ السَّعْيَ, when he reached an age where he could work, قَالَ, he said, Ya Bunayya, meaning Sayyidina Ibrahim then comes to him. Yeah, so this is Sayyidina Ibrahim. Ya Bunayya inni ara fil manami. He said, I have seen a dream. And in this dream, anni azbahuka, I said that I'm sacrificing you. Fanzur ma tara. And he says, Qala ya abati. And he said, look at what I've come to see. And then his son Ismail says, Qala ya abati, which is a really loving gesture from a child to their parent. When they say not ya abi, he says ya abati, which is also found in Surah Yusuf. In Surah Yusuf, when again it's about a dream. It's quite, you can see this connection here, because Ismail refers to his father as ya abati, responding to his father's dream, whereas you have in the story of Yusuf, Yusuf going to his father and says what? He says, Ya abati. He says, oh my father, Yaqub alayhi salam. Yeah, and Yaqub is who? Yaqub is we know Yaqub is to be the son of Ishaq, Ishaq being the brother of Ismail. So there's a bit of a connection here, but here it's the other way around. In Surah Yusuf, Sayyidina, literally at the beginning of the surah, he says, Inni ra'aytu ya abati inni ra'aytu ahada ashara kawkaban والشمس والقمر رأيتهم لي ساجدين. He says, Oh my dear father, Ya abati, I see ra'aytu ahada ashara. This is son telling father, I see 11 stars. وَالشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ, and the sun and the moon. رَأَيْتُهُمْ لِي سَاجِدِينَ, I see them prostrating to me. And then what does the father says? The father say? He says, Ya bunayya, ya bunayya la taqsus ru'yaka. He said, do not tell of your story to anyone. Do not tell your brothers. So his father also in a very loving way says, Ya bunayya. So Ya abati is Ya abi becomes Ya abati as a sign of affection, and Ya bunayya is a sign of affection from a father to his son. So here what we have is where he says to his father says exactly the same, but it's flipped the other way, where the father says to son, Ya bunayya inni ara fil manami anni azbahuka. He said that I see myself sacrificing you. And the son says to his father, Qala ya abati if'al ma tu'mar. Ya abati if'al ma tu'mar. The first words that come out of his mouth are, oh my father, do whatever you've been commanded to do. ستجدني إن شاء الله من الصابرين, and you will certainly find me. Satajidu, and you shall certainly find me minas sabirin. Yeah, you will certainly find me, insha'Allah, minas sabirin. You will find me of those who are patient. So he completely accepted his will of his father. So what that tells us is a couple of things, I guess, in terms of filling that gap between Sayyidina Ismail being 7 years or 13 years or whatever that age may be, and the time of his birth is if Sayyidina Ibrahim was going regularly there, then it shows a type of relationship that the father had with his son. Yeah, because of the way, the affection with which Sayyidina Ismail speaks of his father. And it also suggests, and this is just a reflection here, it's not, nothing is mentioned about this, but as a reflection also in how Hajar would have been referring to Sayyidina, would have been teaching Ismail about his father where his father wasn't there. Because of the way he addresses his father, it shows a real powerful, not just a respect, but the words like Ya Abati say more than respect. It's about love and affection and something a lot more, kind of more than just physically respect. Because you can respect somebody and fear them. Yeah, respect comes from various means. So this is a respect that comes from a profound love. So Allahu Alam, the gap is there, but when you look at the way they address one another, then it seems to be a very powerful relationship where a father can come to his son and tell him very honestly, this is the dream I saw, and be able to communicate that to him. And for his son to just not even question it and accept it as he accepted it the first time round. فلما أسلما وتله للجبين وناديناه أن يا إبراهيم. And when they both aslama, when they both accepted it, yeah, they came to terms with that moment. When they came to terms with that moment, Sayyidina Ismail placed his neck down to where he was going to be sacrificed. We do not know, and we have no account of where Sayyida Hajar was or what she said about this account. Yeah, we don't know. At that point, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and وَنَادَيْنَاهُ, and we called Ibrahim. Ya Ibrahim, Allah says, and we called Ibrahim, and Ya Ibrahim, قَدْ صَدَّقْتَ الرُّؤْيَا, that you have fulfilled, you have accepted, you were true to the dream that you saw. إِنَّا كَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. Allah says, and in showing your tasdeeq of it, your acceptance of it and fulfilling it, this is how we repay those who do ihsan, meaning those who go above and beyond, which is ihsan. This is how we repay them. Inna hadha lahuwal bala'ul mubin, and this certainly is a great and manifest difficulty and test. Wa fadaynahu bidhibhin azim, and Allah says, and we sacrificed in his place a great sacrifice, dhibhin azim. What it doesn't mention though is the ram. The Quran doesn't tell us that it was a ram. That comes from, again, various stories, the biblical accounts, and many scholars kind of agree that it was another animal that was sacrificed in it, in his place. But the Quran just says with a great sacrifice. وَتَرَكْنَا عَلَيْهِ فِي الْآخِرِينَ, and we left him with the rest. Salamun ala Ibrahim. What's interesting is, what does God say again? He says once again to him, Salamun ala Ibrahim. So it doesn't just come once in the Quran. Salamun ala Ibrahim the first time, Kuni bardam wa salamun ala Ibrahim. And again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Salamun ala Ibrahim, kadhalika najzil muhsinin. And God repeats the same thing again. He said, and may peace be upon Ibrahim for his acceptance of the will of God. And he says, this is how we repay those who do ihsan. And then he sandwiches it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts it again afterwards and says, كَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And this concept of ihsan is quite an important one, because it appears, it's a quite a central theme in the Quran. And it's quite a central theme in our religion, because the pillar hadith in our religion is the hadith of Jibreel. And the hadith of Jibreel tells us that there are 3 stations to belief. And the highest, so there's simply Islam, which is accepting God and carrying out the prayer, the fast, etc. And then there's Iman, and the Iman is the belief in the articles of faith. And then the 3rd stage, where Sayyidina Jibreel, when he comes to the Prophet, he says to him, وَمَا هُوَ الْإِحْسَانُ, tell me about, أَخْبِرْنِي عَنِ الْإِحْسَانِ, tell me about ihsan. And the Prophet says to him that ihsan is to believe, that is to see God when you worship him. And if you can't see him, then know that he at least sees you. So this idea of ihsan is about perfecting oneself and always aspiring. So ihsan is about being aspirational. And I really believe that there is a call in the Quran and in the hadith literature for us to always excel in everything that we do. That's a calling for us as Muslims, to never just accept the basic, but to always aspire in whatever field that might be, but to always aspire high. So if I suppose the message for all of us is that if ever you're contemplating whether you should go for that next job or should work harder or move further up the chain, then ask yourself, what is stopping you? And if there's better things that you can be doing with your time, then you should be doing those better things. But if it's nothing other than I can't be bothered, then that's not a good enough reason, because we should be people of ihsan. We should always be pushing ourselves and not just accepting that we've plateaued. Yeah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us then that what's the reward of somebody who does ihsan. We know that there's another verse where Allah says, what is the jaza of ihsan? Ma jaza'ul ihsan illa ihsan. God says, there is the only compensation I can give you for being aspirational, for doing ihsan, is by giving you ihsan from me. Yeah. So God gives you something even greater. And so it's quite a powerful theme, inshallah. I've thought many times over about just doing either a lecture or maybe a mini course on just the concept of ihsan, as in going on a journey to the Quran about how this word ihsan is used, how often it appears, and hopefully it'll be something that motivates people. But I find it fascinating, and I'm sure the students out there that will know that I've contemplated this a few times. كَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And then Allah says, إِنَّهُ مِنْ عِبَادِنَا الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Allah says, and he certainly, meaning Ibrahim alayhi salam, is from our servants, our worshippers that were the believers. وَبَشَّرْنَاهُ بِإِسْحَاقٍ نَبِيًّا. And Allah then tells us, and we have given him glad tidings of Ishaq. So what does that teach us? Well, that tells us that Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he had that dream about sacrificing, that the child he was going to sacrifice was Ismail. It wasn't Ishaq. According to the biblical accounts, it seems to be that it was Ishaq, but actually we know that it was Ishaq that this was made. It was Ismail that was made reference to, because Ishaq at this point wasn't even born. Yeah, he wasn't even born. And it was actually after that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَتْ رُسُلُنَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ بِالْبُشْرَى. So this is where the story in Surah Hud appears, and it was there that we hear about the birth of Ishaq. I've got a few questions that I might need to look at. So let me just skim through those. Was there a mushaf when the Prophet was alive in any form? Was there a mushaf? Yes, there was. There were many masahif. And by mushaf, what we mean is there were parchments. So there were the Sahaba, the scribes of the Prophet, so amongst them was Sayyidina Muawiyah, for instance. There were a few scribes that were designated to write Quran, and they would actually write them down. And these existed in the time of the Prophet. And we know when Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh, when he was going to compile that first mushaf, he asked for all of those people to bring whatever they had. Yeah, so they were mushaf in the sense that they were parchments. But remember, the way the Quran was preserved was primarily in an oral tradition. It was always already in people's hearts. So when Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq wanted to collate the Quran in a single mushaf, his goal was about having everything in one place. It wasn't about him having doubts as to what the Quran was, because there were many Sahaba in Sayyidina Abu Bakr's caliphate. There were many Sahaba at that point that had memorized the Quran, including Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq, including Sayyidina Umar, including many Sayyidina Uthman, and so on. There were many, probably over. We know that there were at least 40 of the Hufaz that were killed in battle, which is why Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq asked for them to put the mushaf together in the first place. He feared that we may start losing Hufaz, and therefore there's a danger that we don't have a single mushaf. That's why he took that challenge on. But there was no doubt about what the Quran was, and there's also no, although there's some difference as to the ordering of the Quran in terms of what the who decided the order. Pretty much most scholars agree that it's tawqifi, and what that means is that it was inspired by God to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ told the Sahaba exactly where each surah should go. So they knew because they were already been told that. And there's hadith on this too. So I hope that answers that question. So a prophet can never doubt the revelation of the dreams. No. I heard one narration that said Ibrahim may have misinterpreted his dream that told him to sacrifice Ismail. This is incorrect. Yes, it is. There isn't any basis for that, as far as I'm aware. But it doesn't fit in line with a prophet anyway. Yeah. As for whether it was Ismail or Ishaq, I've made it clear that I believe that it was Ismail. However, I also want to say that if there's anybody out there that has heard otherwise, that's okay. This is not a matter of faith. Yeah, if you for whatever reason find the argument that Ishaq was the one that was being sacrificed, that's more compelling, and there is argument for it even within the Muslim tradition, then that's fine. That's perfectly okay. If that seems to be more compelling for you. Let's pause here, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair for attending this class. I hope it's been beneficial. Inshallah, next week we're going to continue from the biha, so the moment of the sacrifice, and we're going to hopefully start making our way to the forming of the Kaaba, the first building of the Kaaba, and we'll go from the Quran, because the Quran has a lot to say about that, inshallah. So, Jazakumullah khair. I will leave it there. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.